Hello everyone. This is the second lecture for Chapter 1 and I am now on Slide 7, which is where we left off on from the previous 15-minute recorded lecture. So in this one I want to cover 3 or 4 learning objectives. We're starting with the definitions of auditing, attest, and assurance services. So let me try to briefly explain what this is all about. A CPA stands for Certified Public Accountant, and the CPA has the privilege given by society to conduct certain functions in our society. So in order to have this right to do these functions, the CPA is given a license through the state boards of accounting. And so these 3 circles here represents the type of services that CPAs can provide. Now, the book covers a variety of these services, but we really focus on the auditing service in this course. But I want to introduce you to the other 2. They are important services offered by CPAs. Many people make an excellent living conducting these services. And you can also learn more about these other services in the Audit 2 course offered here at FAU. So on Slide 8, we have the definition of auditing. So this is a definition adopted by one of our regulators, and it is a systematic process of objectively obtaining and evaluating evidence. So let's talk about that little first part. That's what this course is about, is learning what that process is of obtaining and evaluating evidence, and trying to start you on the journey of having the type of judgment needed to understand how you obtain and evaluate that evidence. So the next part about this definition is regarding assertions about economic actions and events. Now, we talked about that in the first part of Lecture 1 from this chapter, about what management's assertions are. So you need to really get familiar with those assertions. I can't emphasize enough how important those are. And the next part of this definition, to ascertain the degree of correspondence between those assertions and establish criteria. So the criteria we look at are the generally accepted accounting principles. So when management produces a set of financial statements, you evaluate those statements against GAAP to determine whether the financial statements are in accordance with GAAP. And finally, in the last part of this, and communicate the results to interested users. So that's a very important part of our role as CPAs. On the next slide, we have the definition of attest. Now, auditing is a type of attestation service, but it's a very specific type. So in an attestation service, these occur when a practitioner is engaged to issue or report on a subject matter, or an assertion about a subject matter that's the responsibility of another party. So an example here is you might attest that somebody has properly complied with the contract. And finally, we have the third item, which is an assurance. And this is you assure people that things are done in a certain way. So attestation and auditing are types of assurance, but assurance is much broader than this. Now, the assurance and attestation services are covered, as I said, in Audit 2. We will be focusing in this course on auditing, which leads us to the next slide. So the basic format of an audit is outlined on this page. So let's start with the left-hand column, which talks about what management's responsibility is. So management establishes internal controls, the kinds you studied about in your systems course. They process transactions, and they accumulate information about those transactions and account balances, prepare a financial statement, and issue those financial statements. So the auditor, their job is to obtain evidence test the assertions against criteria, which in the U.S. is generally accepted accounting principles, determine the fairness of the financial statements based on that evidence collected, and issue an audit report that is sent out at the same time as the financial statements. So notice the arrows corresponding between those two things. You have the terms of engagement means that there's a letter, and it's actually called an engagement letter, that outlines the contract between the auditor and the client. So, so they make an agreement at the beginning of this process. Then the auditor will collect evidence about internal controls, the transactions, and the account balances, and then they will test those items based on the financial statements that management prepares. Then the auditor, based on that evidence, will determine whether the financial statements are fairly stated, and they'll communicate that, and that communication is in the form of an audit report that is sent out to users of the financial statements at the same time that the financial statements are released. So throughout this class, we're going to see some of this reporting and process, and I will. That's actually one of the homework assignments for the first week, is to find an audit report and look at that. So let's go to slide 12. The regulator came up with some fundamental concepts in creating a overall, it's sort of like a conceptual framework it's the equivalent of the conceptual framework that you have in the accounting area. But these three concepts override what we try to do as part of an audit. So let's first look at materiality. As auditors, we can't look at every single thing. We can't look at every transaction. Companies have millions, sometimes billions of transactions. Just imagine how many transactions American Express has. So what we do as auditors is we decide what is the information that makes a difference to a user. And that definition of materiality actually was established by the Supreme Court. And so we think about how much information the different users of those financial statements need, and that informs us on how much and what testing to do and what kinds of things to test. So we don't test every small transactions. We test some small transactions because they could be an indicator of a larger problem, but materiality surrounds everything that we do and informs our decisions as we go about thinking about how to conduct the audit. Okay, on slide 14, we have the definition of audit risk. Now, we're going to talk about audit risk quite a bit throughout this class, but the idea here is that the auditor is trying to manage the auditor's own risk and to issue the correct opinion on the financial statement. So, and that definition given here is the official definition of what audit risk is. So, as auditors, we can't be perfect. There is potential that the financial statements may be incorrect, and that we can't spend years doing the audit. So what has arisen over practice is this idea that we want to provide reasonable but not absolute assurance to our readers of our report that the financial statements do not contain material errors or material misstatements. That was an important little slip up I made just there, is that what we're saying to readers is that you can have reasonable assurance that the financial statements are free of material misstatement, whether due to error or fraud. So we're not guaranteeing that the financial statements are free of fraud. We're guaranteeing that they're, we're providing reasonable assurance that they're free of material fraud. Okay, so we're trying to give readers comfort Now, if we get the audit report wrong and those financial statements have a material misstatement, then we could be potentially sued for telling users the wrong information. So we will expand on that in a chapter on legal liability later in the course. All right, so on slide 15 is the third overall concept, and that's audit evidence. So as part of the audits, we gather evidence, and as we collect that evidence, we have to evaluate both the relevance and the reliability of that information. Is the information we're collecting relevant to the assertion being tested, and can the information be relied on to signal true information about that assertion? So these are important things that the auditor has to weigh. I will say to you that understanding relevance and reliability doesn't come to you right away, that you have to practice auditing for a while before you get good at really understanding whether relevance and reliability is present. On slide 16, we have another important concept, and that is the idea of sampling. And I'm sure most of you all have been exposed to sampling in other courses here at FAU. We use some mathematical concepts involving sampling to make inferences about a large population based on a limited number of observations. Now, this is done in many places in our society. The one that I always think about is predicting the President of the United States. And I'm not sure if y'all have paid attention to this, but when there's a presidential election, the polling companies will poll as few as 750 or as many as 3,000 people in order to predict how 180 million people are going to vote. So you can use sampling as an important, powerful tool to draw inferences about a population from a small number of observations. So where in the presidential elections, you're probably trying to predict how people will vote. In sampling and auditing, you look at a small number of transactions, and from that you infer whether the transactions are recorded properly or not. So we will talk about sampling quite a bit more later in the course. On slide 17, we have the major phases of the audit, and the course is divided into discussion of these. In the first 3 or 4 weeks, we're not even going to talk about how to do the audit. We're going to talk about information about society and where the audit is and how the features of the profession, and then we get into the nuts and bolts of actually having to do an audit. It is my belief that you can't really understand how an audit works until you understand all of these professional responsibilities that we have. But by the end of the course, I think you will understand how an audit is conducted from beginning to end. So the first step is you decide whether you want to work with a client or you decide whether you want to continue to work with them. So that's a pretty involved process. We'll spend a whole week talking about that. You have preliminary engagement activities where you collect information that help inform you about the audit. You plan the audit, and depending on the type of audit that you're doing, as I will explain later, you consider and audit internal control. Sometimes you only consider it, and sometimes you have to both consider it and test internal controls, but we will explain that going forward. Then you actually do the audit of the different account balances and transaction cycles. You wrap up the audit, and then finally you evaluate your results and issue an audit report, which is the primary means of communication between the auditor and the readers. So this completes lecture 2. So I am going to sign off now, and in the third lecture for chapter 1 we will talk about issuing an audit report.